You've researched and written very extensively on the spectacular rise of China and what this means for the world. So we kind of wanted just to start with that. Why is the rise of China important for us to understand in the West? And could you also dispel any common misconceptions or myths about this?
Well, I think the first obvious element that people in the West need to understand is that we've inherited a world that has largely been shaped by North Atlantic capitalism and imperialism. So, from the very beginning of the Industrial Revolution in mid-late 1700s, the global economy's been dominated by two forces. The first was the British Empire, and then that was overtaken by the United States. And now we are in a period of transition, which is absolutely historic, not just because it's a transition from one country to another, but we're seeing China's rise as a shift towards the Asia Pacific. That's part of it. It's a shift away from the Anglophone world and Anglophone culture, which has been dominant. And that's a big threat and a big fear for a lot of people in the West, which is kind of completely understandable because their entire worldview that's been inherited is now shifting and changing and going along with all the other transformations that are happening in the West. There are positives and also negatives there in terms of how people can react. So that's really the first point, that we're seeing a shift towards the global majority. And that's a big difference. And it's something which I think is very positive, has a lot of potential for human development as a species, but it does mean that many vested interests are going to be seriously challenged. So that's the first thing. It's the economic challenge to Western imperialism that China's rise represents. Second, I would say this is very much related to why China is a rising economy, is that China is an explicitly socialist oriented society. It talks about only being in the primary stage of socialism, and that's a fascinating development in terms of socialist theory and discussions about transitions. But essentially, this represents, I think, the second big challenge for the West, which is the ideological challenge. Those of us who lived through the collapse of the Soviet Union, for example, were told this was not just the end of communism and socialism, it was the end of history. And now we find that that's not true at all. We've had almost 30 years of delusions about the way the world was headed. I mean, to be fair, Francis Fukuyama, who came out with the book, has kind of backtracked quite considerably on his views. But still, this idea that so-called liberal democratic capitalism is the natural state of affairs and is the way forward. I'm not sure that's really an idea that has much purchase beyond Western liberal elites these days. I think everybody recognizes the West is in a profound crisis. So China's path of modernization and development and bringing in these socialist elements, I think, is very important. And I think that's a big challenge for people in the West who had simply considered Marxism and socialism to be completely finished and dead. And now suddenly they're having to come out with the idea that the world has been taken over by the Chinese Communist Party. The CCP is running everything now. So they've gone from one extreme to another instead of having a balanced approach. So economic, ideological, and really the last one is diplomatic and political, because China's rise, especially since the opening up in 78, has been almost entirely peaceful. China's peaceful rise, 45 years without the Chinese being involved in major war or conflict. Really, that's such an obvious contrast with Britain and American history. Just think how many wars Britain and America have been involved in since in the last 45 years. It's difficult to count them. So that is a very important point, and that's where this concept, I think, of the global majority is a really useful one, because it allows voices to be heard that have been suppressed. It allows countries' national interests, which have been overlooked and overridden by a small number of Western imperialist countries. It allows them to have an option that they did not have before. So this goes back to the idea of a multipolar world. And I think, again, this is something that many people in the West simply can't get, because they've gone from a very bipolar world, from the Cold War of the Soviet Union and versus the United States to a unipolar world, which did not last very long. And now we're in a multipolar world. And the multipolar world is important because it's not just China. China's kind of spearheading an opening up that allows all sorts of countries and all sorts of regions to develop and express their interests. So that's really exciting, I think. That's really what I would say the three main challenges to Western attitudes. I think also there's a couple of myths which we need to challenge. First is it's a kind of mirage. I'm amazed by the number of people, including newspaper commentators and so on, who imagine that China's growth and development is based on faked statistics and data. And my attitude is always you cannot argue with these people. You can just say, go and look for yourself, visit China and tell me it's not real. If it's a mirage, go and touch it, go and experience it for yourself, and then come back and say that it's not real. So I think that's one of the big myths that is part of Western ideological responses to China's rise. The second is also that China is an aggressive expansionist power. Well, as I said, that's simply not the case. Even if you take the entire history from 1949 onwards, China has very rarely been involved in conflicts, and those conflicts have almost always been on its borders. They've never been transcontinental wars of empire or intervention, the way that Britain and the United States have done for the last 250 years. So that's a myth. It's essential that we confront that particular one because it's obviously one which is extremely dangerous in terms of the policies that our political leaders and choices that they might make.